February 22nd, 1944. Over the Eifel region of western Germany. The morning air was thin, bitter and metallic, the kind of cold that clung to aluminum and made every vibration inside a cockpit feel like an exposed nerve. 40 minutes into the escort mission, Captain Raymond Holt's P-47 Thunderbolt had already taken 2 near misses from flak that sounded like stones thrown against the skin of the aircraft. Yet the big radial engine in front of him, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800, growled with the same steady, almost indifferent rhythm it had at takeoff. Below him, hundreds of feet of snow-dusted forest flickered through gaps in cloud, and each flicker carried the same unspoken calculation: return home or fall here. Then the ambush began. The attack came from above, not the usual defensive climb from German fighters, but a sudden coordinated dive from a formation Holt hadn't seen on the radar plot before takeoff. The first tracers ripped past his right wing, thin lines of red-white light that sliced the air before his eyes registered them as deadly. He banked left, hard. The engine absorbed the maneuver without protest. A second burst followed, then a third. Holt felt the aircraft shudder as cannon shells slammed into the nose, cowling and oil cooler. The cockpit rattled. Gauges blurred. Something loose struck the instrument panel with a sharp metallic click. For an instant, a single needle-thin instant, he thought the engine would seize, stall and silence itself into a coffin. It didn't. The R-2800 roared louder, staggering but alive, its tone now deeper, harsher, like metal gritting its teeth. Holt forced his breathing steady. Training said, if a radial engine lost a cylinder, the imbalance would announce itself with violent vibration. What he felt instead was a wounded giant still pushing forward, refusing to acknowledge the laws written for lesser machines. Extract from Holt's after-action log. I counted 19 holes in the cowling. 1 shell tore the oil line clean, but the engine, the damned engine, refused to die. As he dived toward cloud cover, the smell of burnt oil filled the cockpit, thick and sweet, mixing with the sharp odor of overheated metal. Visibility narrowed to a tunnel of gray. He checked the manifold pressure, lower than normal but holding. The temperature gauge crept toward the red. Every indicator suggested the engine should have surrendered, but the prop kept turning. By the time he reached the tree line, Holt knew he had minutes, not hours. The escort formation had scattered. The bombers were still outbound. Alone now, he leveled the nose, listening to the uneven heartbeat of the machine keeping him alive. Each rotation felt like a mechanical decision made against reason. Command reports later noted that the engine sustained catastrophic damage, a phrase that meant little in the moment. What Holt understood was simpler. The aircraft shouldn't be flying. The engine shouldn't be functioning. The sky should not still be beneath him. 5 minutes into the descent, another burst of flak blossomed ahead, black puffs that echoed across the valley like distant thunder. Holt felt the shock wave through the fuselage. A fragment struck the left side of the cowling, peeling back metal like paper. Still the engine held, a short paragraph of micro-focus. He listened. He adjusted throttle. He prayed the rhythm wouldn't change. According to intercepted Luftwaffe radio traffic that morning, German pilots reported a heavy American fighter trailing smoke, refusing to fall, a detail that emerged only after the war. Their disbelief matched Holt's. Fear settled into calculation. The nearest friendly strip was across the Rhine, 30 miles west. At reduced power, with leaking oil and a cracked supercharger case, the R-2800 could not sustain altitude for long. Holt trimmed the aircraft, leaned the fuel mixture, and angled toward the river. The vibration worsened but remained controllable, a contradiction engineers would later struggle to quantify. Psychological note: one intelligence officer added to the debrief months later. Pilot believed the aircraft was fighting with him, a projection common in extreme survival cases. By dusk, the haze lifted just enough for Holt to see the broken line of the river below. The aircraft shook again, a deep, uneven tremor that signaled the final stage of oil starvation. The engine's growl thinned into a metallic whistle. Holt lowered the nose for the final glide. What happened next would become part of the engine's legend, with nearly every fluid line ruptured, 2 cylinders shattered, and the cowling torn like shrapnel. The R-2800 completed the last 3 miles under partial power, coughing but alive, carrying Holt to a frozen auxiliary strip moments before the prop locked itself solid. He landed on instinct more than technique, sliding across compacted snow, steam rising from the engine like the breath of an exhausted animal. When mechanics reached the plane, they found bullet holes so numerous that counting them required chalk. One of them said only, "How is it even here?" March 1944. RAF Debden, England. Snow still clung to the edges of the taxiways when the engineering board sat down to review Holt's report. The hangar doors were open to vent the smell of burnt oil from the crippled Thunderbolt parked outside. The same P-47 that had limped home on an engine, so damaged that technicians quietly took photographs before touching it, as if the machine might collapse into unrecognizable parts once disturbed. The briefing began with a question no one could yet answer. Why had the R-2800 survived damage that should have killed it instantly? Colonel Morgan, the group's engineering officer, opened the file with a flat voice that concealed his astonishment. Orders for today. Classify the incident, compare it against existing engine loss statistics, and determine whether this was anomaly or design. His tone suggested he already knew the answer, but needed proof, not belief. Across the room, mechanics stood at the back, caps in hand. They had seen the engine up close, cylinders torn, cooling fins shattered, oil sump cracked, fragments embedded in the supercharger housing. A machine that should have frozen in mid-air had instead dragged the pilot 30 miles across hostile terrain. For them, the question wasn't why it survived, but how it kept pulling with half its insides missing. Morgan passed around photographs, close shots of the cowling peeled back like bruised armor, cracked ignition housings, bullet paths that entered one side and exited through the opposite firewall. Recorded damage count 62 distinct penetrations, he said, 23 from cannon fire. The engine maintained between 48 and 61% rated power during the pilot's retreat. Silence answered him. Then a soft whistle from the back. The context mattered. Germany still contested the skies above the Eifel. Luftwaffe fighter groups, particularly JG-2 and JG-26, were increasingly desperate, throwing every available aircraft into intercept missions. American bomber formations relied on long-range fighters like Holt's Thunderbolt to shield them from these attacks. Losing a single P-47 was acceptable. Losing escort coverage for a bomber stream was not. Holt's mission, like hundreds before it, came down to a strategic logic written in cold arithmetic. Heavy fighters absorbed punishment so bomber crews didn't have to. Engines were expected to fail under such stress. Lives were not expected to survive it. That was why Holt's survival disrupted the assumptions written into the escort doctrine. According to Air Technical Intelligence Command, Morgan said, tapping the report, radial engines have a higher probability of surviving battle damage than inline engines, due to absence of a liquid cooling system. But this, he gestured toward a photograph of a cylinder shredded by shrapnel, was not survivable by any conventional definition. A young officer flipped through the pages. Sir, this wasn't the first case. Heads turned. He opened another file, incidents from the 56th Fighter Group, where pilots returned with engines smoking, leaking, or running on fewer cylinders yet still intact. One report described a Thunderbolt flying 97 miles with a shot-out oil cooler. Another recorded a pilot who landed after losing an entire cylinder head, the piston hammering air with each revolution. Patterns were emerging, but the command still needed causation. Strategic assessment, Morgan read aloud from the typed sheet. The R-2800's survivability affects mission planning. If it continues to demonstrate resistance to catastrophic failure, escort altitude, engagement range and breakaway tactics can be adjusted with reduced loss projections. Then, more quietly, that means we can push these pilots further into contested airspace. The psychological weight settled across the room. The men who flew the Thunderbolts knew the statistics. Engines failed, fire consumed cockpits, smoke blurred sightlines, falling meant capture or death. But this engine, this brute, this mechanical contradiction, suggested a new calculus, that a machine could be wounded but not killed, not quickly, not easily. And in war a few minutes of survival could redraw the map of an entire squadron's fate. A micro-cut paragraph shifted focus. Orders were reissued, testing expanded. Confidence grew, cautiously. Extract from Engineering Bulletin Number 27, observed resilience of the R-2800 warrants controlled stress trials. Purpose measure functional limits under simulated ballistic damage. To the pilots it meant something simpler. The P-47's engine could take punishment, and they might get home. But the board warned them not to interpret this as invincibility. Surviving damage did not erase the fear of taking it. Fear remained the constant, technology only adjusted the odds. 3 days after the board's meeting, Holt himself was summoned to a secondary debrief. The room was cold, the windows fogged. One colonel asked him to describe the engine's sound during the retreat, as if tone could be quantified. Holt struggled. It didn't cough the way a dying engine coughs, he said. More like, it was forcing itself forward, like it wasn't ready to give in. The stenographer hesitated before typing that line, not because it was unclear, but because it hinted at something the file format wasn't built to record, the illusion of intention in a machine built only for combustion. In the margin of the transcript, an intelligence officer later wrote, pilot projection, or behavior consistent with radial construction. A question posed, not answered. What mattered to command now was this: the strategic pattern had changed. If one engine could survive such punishment, others might as well. And that possibility meant the escort doctrine could evolve from defensive endurance to offensive advantage. By the first week of April, engineering commands filed the formal directive: expand P-47 penetration escorts deeper into Germany. Confidence rating increased due to demonstrated engine resilience and battlefield survivability. The Thunderbolt's role shifted that day, not on paper, but in the minds of the men who flew it. April 1944. Wright Field, Ohio. The test hangar smelled of solvent and cold steel, the kind of place where engines arrived either to be certified or condemned. Engineers in long coats gathered around a stripped-down R-2800 mounted on a vibration stand, its cowling removed, its exhaust stubs darkened from years of punishment. Above them, the lights hummed with the same clinical indifference as the technicians preparing the stress instruments. The directive from European Command was clear: replicate Holt's damage, measure the limits, identify the truth behind the myth. What no one expected was how quickly the myth would become data. The first discovery came during the opening test cycle. When the starter engaged and the engine sputtered into its heavy rolling idle, the entire stand shuddered, not from malfunction, but from mass. 2,200 pounds of radial architecture created a gravity of its own. That weight, often criticized by pilots who favored lighter machines, was now reframed as armor. Chief Engineer Lawson leaned over the manifold gauges. "Not elegant," he muttered, "but it doesn't need to be." The second discovery came moments later, when a controlled burst from the test rig's ballistic projector struck the outer cylinders. Shrapnel peppered the cooling fins. One cylinder head cracked, venting a thin mist of oil. The engine coughed once, then steadied. Lawson scribbled notes fast enough to tear the paper. Maintaining 82% power at simulated altitude. Unbelievable. A younger engineer, face pale, asked the only question that mattered: how is it still running? Lawson pointed at the radial layout. 12 cylinders arranged like ribs. Damage doesn't cascade. Lose one, the others keep the rhythm. The geometry absorbs the failure. It was an elegant explanation, but incomplete. Radials had existed for decades, not all were this stubborn. Something else powered the miracle. That something emerged during the second test sequence. Technicians increased the RPM, the engine roared, shedding loose flakes of metal like a wounded animal refusing to collapse. They repeated Holt's damage pattern: oil line severed, induction housing cracked, 2 simulated cannon strikes to the forward accessory case. The engine screamed under the strain, a brutal, uneven howl that rattled the observation windows, and yet, it did not quit. Extract from Project Notebook 17B, observed behavior does not align with projected thermal failure curve. Engine exhibits delayed seizure under catastrophic oil loss. Time to failure exceeds expectation by factor of 5 times longer than physics predicted. 5 times longer than the manuals insisted. 5 times longer for a pilot to survive. The discovery escalated beyond engineering curiosity. It became a strategic revelation. As days passed, the team mapped each anomaly. The R-2800's thick crankcase walls, heavier than any contemporary inline engine, prevented warping even when oil vanished. Its massive fin area dissipated heat long enough for an escape glide. Its dual magneto system fired through fractured leads. Its fuel-air mixture remained stable even as metal fragments disrupted airflow. But the most startling discovery came from a failure that did not occur. 3 tests in a row, with oil intentionally drained and a cylinder intentionally destroyed, the R-2800 kept running until the propeller itself began to warp from heat. The engine died only when the propeller could no longer convert rotation into thrust. "The weak point," one engineer whispered, "is everything except the engine." That line circulated through command channels faster than any technical diagram. A micro-cut paragraph snapped into focus. "Engines aren't supposed to survive betrayal. This one did." Psychological impact followed quickly. Pilots across Europe began requesting Thunderbolts over Mustangs for deep escort missions. They trusted speed, they respected agility, but they believed in survivability, and belief in war was as potent as steel. Reports from the front reflected the new mindset. A pilot from the 353rd Fighter Group wrote, "Confidence is a weapon. When the engine keeps going after the bullets hit, you don't panic, you fight." But for intelligence officers, belief was not enough. They needed patterns, and they found them. Engines that should have seized remained functional long enough to clear German airspace. The discovery was clear. The R-2800 didn't survive bullets. It survived the systems failing around it. That difference changed doctrine. By the end of April, a confidential memorandum circulated through the European theater headquarters. Recommendation: reclassify P-47 units for extended penetration escorts. Engine survivability offers operational leverage in contested airspace. Pilots may absorb damage without immediate loss of aircraft or mission integrity. The language was clinical. The meaning was not. Pilots were now expected to operate deeper, longer, closer to the sources of enemy fire, because their engine would endure what their nerves might not. Another psychological insight seeped through briefing rooms. A machine that refuses to die changes the way a man chooses to live. And so the escalation was not just technical, it was human.
The Thunderbolt,
Once criticized for its bulk, was becoming something else entirely, the fighter that came home even when its pilot thought he wouldn't. May 1944, near the Ruhr Valley. The mission was supposed to be routine, or as routine as any penetration escort into the heart of German industry could be. Holt had flown twice since his near-fatal return, but command now selected him for an operation that would test not just skill but nerve. The target, a bomber stream tasked with crippling synthetic fuel plants. The threat: concentrated flak, veteran interceptors, and a sky thick with smoke trails. At 13,000 feet, the world changed. Holt saw the flashes first, white arcs rising from the city perimeter, the signature of 88 guns firing in disciplined rhythm. The formations tightened. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the concussion of exploding shells. Then came the fighters. JG-26 dove out of the glare with the precision of a hammer striking iron. Their opening pass shredded the left side of the escort screen. Holt banked hard, too hard, and the pressure forced his breath into a shallow gasp. The engine responded instantly, the R-2800's massive prop biting into the air with a growl that felt like defiance. His radio crackled. "Thunderbolt 7. Brake, brake." He didn't have time to answer. A burst of cannon fire streaked past his canopy, 2 shells grazing the fuselage, one striking the engine cowling with a blow that sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. The aircraft lurched, instruments jittered, and for the second time in his life, Holt expected silence. But the engine howled, louder, angrier, as though insulted by the injury. He pulled into a climbing turn, trading altitude for survival. Smoke curled from the nose, but the propeller kept its rhythm, blades slicing the air with unwavering force. His heartbeat matched it, rapid and uneven. Below him, the bomber formations wavered. Without escorts, they were helpless, slow-moving silhouettes surrounded by predators. Fear cut through the chaos. If he abandoned his position, the gap would widen. If he stayed, he risked being torn apart. Duty 1. He pushed forward. The Thunderbolt surged. The attacker reappeared, a Bf-109 with yellow nose markings, its wings flashing in the sun. Holt timed the merge with cold mechanical precision. He fired a 2-second burst. Tracers stitched across the German fighter's fuselage. The enemy pilot snapped into a dive, but Holt's victory lasted only a heartbeat. Another cannon strike tore into the engine's right side, metal ripped, oil sprayed, flames licked the cowling, his vision blurred from the shock, the cockpit filled with smoke and a metallic scent that tasted like burning machinery. For a terrifying moment, he thought the engine had finally surrendered. Then, the roar returned, wounded, guttural, alive. Extract from After-Action Report 72A. Pilot experienced a brief loss of power followed by partial recovery. Engine continued to operate under extreme thermal stress. Pilot maintained airspeed sufficient for combat maneuver. Holt pushed the throttle. The engine responded, coughing but obedient. He turned back toward the bombers, toward the danger, knowing that a single mistake would turn the burning machine in front of him into an anchor. A micro-cut moment of clarity. Smoke behind, flak ahead, one engine between both. Another group of German fighters sliced through the formation. Holt dove into them, guns blazing. He didn't feel brave. He felt propelled forward by the engine's refusal to die. The battle dissolved into flashes of light, arcs of shadow, and the steady beat of a radial engine fighting beyond logic. One bomber staggered out of formation, trailing fire. Holt swung beneath it, firing at the attackers until the final German fighter broke away, engine smoking. The B-17 leveled out, barely, its crew alive because Holt stayed in the sky. The adrenaline collapsed into exhaustion. Only then did he notice the engine temperature, far beyond redline. Oil pressure flickered. Flames sputtered along the cowling, contained only because the airflow tore them back. He turned west. The retreat became its own battle, altitude dropping, noise increasing, survival narrowing. The engine wasn't running anymore. It was resisting death, one tortured rotation at a time. Each mile felt stolen, each second borrowed. Crossing the Rhine, the engine's tone shifted, a lower grinding pitch, the sound of metal scraping metal inside a machine that had already exceeded every mechanical prediction of its lifespan. Holt whispered, "Just a little longer." By the time he sighted the first friendly strip, the propeller's rotation slowed, irregular. Flames flickered through gaps in the shattered cowling. He lowered the landing gear, 2 wheels extended. The third refused. He landed anyway. The Thunderbolt skidded, veered, and finally stopped in a scream of metal and snow. The engine wheezed once, a long trembling exhale, before locking solid. Holt sat motionless, listening to the silence that followed. Not relief, not triumph, just silence. When the mechanics approached, they froze. 2 cylinders were missing, not damaged, missing. The oil system was destroyed. Fragments of cannon shells were embedded deep in the accessory case. The engine had run 20 minutes longer than any calculation permitted. A mechanic whispered the only words that fit: "It shouldn't be alive, and neither should you." June 1944. 8th Air Force Engineering Division. The remains of Holt's engine sat on a steel examination cradle like a relic, charred, twisted, blackened by fire and impact, yet recognizable in its stubborn geometry. A dozen mechanics and engineers circled it in silence, each processing the same contradiction. The machine had survived long enough to get its pilot home, even though the autopsy revealed that survival should have been impossible. Colonel Morgan leaned over the broken assembly case, with the weariness of a man who had run out of vocabulary. "We're not documenting an engine failure," he said. "We're documenting an engine that refused to comply with physics." He tapped a finger against a jagged fragment of a missing cylinder mount. "This came off mid-flight. That means Holt flew 20 minutes with a cylinder gone entirely." One of the younger engineers swallowed hard. "Sir, without that cylinder, the crank should have—" "Yes," Morgan said. "It should have seized. It didn't." His tone had the numb certainty of someone stating a fact the mind could not yet file. Next came the formal evaluations. Oil system, destroyed. Cooling system, non-functional. Induction housing, ruptured. Crankcase, cracked in multiple locations. Propeller hub, heat-warped. Magnetos, one shattered, one somehow still firing. The report read like a list of terminal failures, failures that should have killed the engine instantly, not allowed it to carry a pilot across contested airspace. Extract from Technical Summary 44-231. Engine demonstrated prolonged operability despite total oil loss, severe structural compromise, and thermal exposure beyond design thresholds. Remaining power output estimated at 38%. Under it, someone had penciled in the margin. still enough to bring him home. The psychological consequence came next. Holt was cleared from medical observation and returned to duty, but everyone who saw him understood what had changed. He moved differently now, not with bravado but with the quiet awareness of a man living on borrowed time. Mechanics approached him with a reverence usually reserved for pilots who had survived crash landings or captivity. "You shouldn't be standing here," one told him. Holt only nodded. They all knew the truth. The Thunderbolt hadn't saved him. The engine had, and yet, command did not send him home. They sent him back up. Survival was not a reason to withdraw. It was data to inform the next mission. A micro-cut moment captured the divide. He breathed. They measured. War continued. Across the Atlantic, intelligence analysts examined the cumulative test data from Wright Field. The R-2800's resilience was no longer anecdotal. It was measurable, repeatable, weaponizable, and that fact reshaped doctrine. By mid-June, a strategic directive circulated among fighter group commanders. P-47 units would now operate deeper into enemy territory, absorbing frontline risk that previously fell to lighter aircraft. It was a double-edged declaration, empowering but deadly. Every pilot who strapped into a Thunderbolt from that point forward knew exactly what was being asked of them: endure what others could not, survive what others would not. Pilots began referring to the R-2800 with a new nickname, the Iron Heart. Not officially, not in documents, only in quiet conversations outside the briefing huts, where men spoke honestly because the skies demanded honesty. But for mechanics, the aftermath had a different tone. They studied Holt's engine like surgeons reading the biography of a patient who had defied both injury and expectation. One veteran mechanic summed it up perfectly. The airframe landed, the engine delivered him. Reports from other fighter groups soon echoed Holt's case. Pilots returned with engines rattling like coffins, vibrating so violently the instrument glass cracked, yet still producing enough power to keep them above treeline. The legend spread, not as myth, but as observed truth. The consequence of that truth reached Berlin as well. Intercepted Luftwaffe intelligence messages revealed a grudging respect. American radial engine fighters exhibit abnormal endurance after critical damage. Recommend prioritizing airframe, not engine, during attack runs. It was rare for the enemy to acknowledge strength in this way. It meant the Germans understood the nature of their new problem. The engine itself was a threat, because it removed the window of vulnerability they relied upon. By July, the Air Technical Service Command reviewed Holt's case file for inclusion in a classified engineering compendium. The board's closing note captured the gravity of the moment. Case study: Holt, evidence that survivability, when repeated across multiple pilots, alters not only outcome but operational philosophy. Holt's Thunderbolt was placed into storage, not scrapped, preserved for long-term study. Mechanics signed the engine cowling, not out of sentimentality but acknowledgement. The aftermath was not only technical, it was human. Pilots slept easier, not because the sky grew kinder, but because their machines had proven they would fight with them. Confidence became courage. Courage became aggression. Aggression, in the air war over Europe, became survival. In the quiet after the debriefings, Holt was asked how he managed to keep flying under such conditions. He answered with a line that later circulated through every fighter squadron in England: "I didn't stay alive, then I stayed with it." August 1944. A quiet dispersal yard outside Debenham. The war still thundered across France and the Low Countries, but here, among the rows of grounded aircraft and stacked ammunition crates, the world felt muted. Holt stood beside the recovered remains of his Thunderbolt's engine, the same engine that had carried him across the Rhine while burning itself alive. Sunlight crept across its scarred metal slowly, warming what remained of its shattered cylinders. He rested a hand on the cooling fin of what used to be cylinder number 9, now cracked clean through its ribbed casing. It felt strange to touch something that had once moved at over 2,000 revolutions per minute. Strange, too, to realize that the machine had exhausted itself so completely that it would never turn again. Engineers said the failure pattern told a story. Holt believed it told a truth. In the weeks since his second return, he had flown other Thunderbolts, fresh machines, with unblemished cowling and smooth-running radials. Yet none felt the same. Every new engine purred. The Iron Heart had growled. Every new engine followed procedure. The Iron Heart had defied it. Extract from Holt's personal letter: Never sent, I trusted it the way I trust my own breath. It carried me further than courage alone could have carried me. That line, found years later in his papers, captured the essence of the legacy better than any technical bulletin ever would. But command needed a legacy it could use, something operational, measurable, transferable. By autumn, the R-2800's reputation reshaped how the air war was fought. Thunderbolts ran deeper penetration escorts, hunted trains, strafed convoys, and dove on airfields at altitudes that made lighter fighters tremble. Pilots took risks because the machine beneath them had proven it could absorb those risks without immediate death. Confidence, when repeated across an entire air corps, becomes doctrine. Still, Holt wondered about the cost buried inside that confidence. Engines like his were rare, not in design, but in fate. A machine that survived beyond its threshold was a statistical anomaly, not a guarantee. And yet squadrons now flew as though all engines were iron hearts. A micro-cut truth settled over him: survival becomes expectation, expectation becomes danger. The engineers saw another layer entirely. They studied Holt's engine not as a miracle, but as an equation waiting to be solved. In the cracks and fragments they found clues about metallurgy, vibration distribution, airflow under combat stress. Lessons that would shape future aircraft far beyond the war. Technology versus human judgment. The psychological conflict written into every mechanical advancement revealed itself again. Machines improved. Humans pushed harder. Risk migrated, not disappeared. By late August, Holt received transfer orders, training command, stateside. Officially it was a rotation. Unofficially, it was because he had survived more than most men were expected to bear. War has a quiet way of removing its miracles from the front. His final walk across the dispersal yard felt heavier than he expected. Each engine he passed seemed to echo the sound of the one that saved him, the guttural, uneven roar that shouldn't have existed but did. He paused at the doorway of the hangar, the late summer wind carrying the distant drone of another formation climbing into the sky. Young pilots, eager, untested. Engines fresh, unscarred. He hoped they would never learn, the way he learned, what an engine sounds like when it is dying but refuses to stop. At twilight, Morgan joined him, the engineer who had spent more hours studying the broken radial than anyone alive. They stood in silence before the engine one last time. "You know," Morgan said, tracing the cracked casing with 2 fingers, "in another era, this thing would have been melted down. Recycled. Forgotten. But not this one," Holt replied. "No," Morgan said. "Not this one. Not after what it did. There are machines that perform, and machines that serve. This one served." It was the closest thing either man would ever say to acknowledging the unspoken truth that for a brief stretch of sky over Germany, the engine and the pilot had been partners in survival. The light dimmed. The yard quieted. The war moved on. The legacy of Holt's engine became a technical footnote in engineering manuals, a rumor in fighter squadrons, and a story shared in low voices inside briefing huts. Not because it was mystical, but because it embodied the kind of loyalty men projected onto machines that carried them through fear. And years later, when historians reviewed the air war, a single sentence in an operational analysis summed up what the engineers never fully wrote down: some engines failed. A few endured. One survived everything. 2-sentence reflection: machines are built to perform, but sometimes they reveal character, not through perfection, but through refusal. Holt lived because his engine chose endurance over surrender, and history remembers what endurance saves.